Ready to go? Okay. Thank you for coming. It's a nice turnout for the.
Having you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. So it's nice to have a reasonable turnout in the off season. We'd like to welcome the Mayor of Surfside, Mr. Teicher, is here to join us. So a big round of applause. Okay. And we've got a fascinating presentation for us tonight. I really was hoping to be able to use my new clicker thing, but unfortunately the batteries are dead, so we're just going to have to do it without the batteries. But our topic for tonight is Menachem Begin, and the subtitle is A New Israel, because his 1977 revolution, when he came to power, represented a tremendous change in a lot of the thinking about Israel, the thinking within Israel, and as I hope to demonstrate in the next 48 minutes or so, really represents a tremendous step forward in terms of the maturation of Israel as a state. Many people feel it was not such a positive direction in which to mature, but nevertheless, we'll explore that in the next hour. I'd like to start with the joke, which I did receive from a member of the audience. I'm just going to adapt it a little bit. And Elia at torahcafe.com is going to edit it out before we put it on the web, but the joke goes like this. There's this great rabbi who spends a lot of his life studying the Torah and teaching the Torah and counseling people and offering sermons and things like that. And after a long, well-lived life, he goes up to heaven. And the angels are very happy to see him. They say, "Welcome, Rabbi," and they take him into the anteroom, the vestibule. It's beautiful decor and big curtains and things like that. Angels moving back and forth, and they say, "Please have a seat here while we process your admission." And put him down on a nice sofa, give him a little cup of tea. And he's sitting there waiting, very pleased with himself, because this is the culmination of a life well lived. And all of a sudden he hears in the distance a shofar blowing. And then, angels start flying back and forth with great rapidity. And then they come out with these long trumpets, and they're blowing all kinds of sounds, and like everyone's in a tizzy. And he says, "What's going on?" And one of the angels say, "Didn't you hear? Didn't you hear? Shloimi, the Egged bus driver, is here. Shloimi, the Egged bus driver." Egged, of course, is the Israeli bus company, which is known for their somewhat chaotic and creative interpretation of the rules of the road. So, anyways, he's saying, "Oh my gosh, it must be some tzaddik. It must be a hidden tzaddik, a tzaddik nistar, something like that." And he waits to see who's this Shloimi. And the angels bring in Shloimi, and he's wearing like a grimy pair of khaki pants and one of those white wife-beater shirts that's stained, and he's smoking, and he's spitting out sunflower seed shells, and he's swearing in Hebrew and things like that. And the angels just guide him in straight into the pearly gates, so to speak. I don't know if we have pearly gates, but you get the image. So the rabbi is saying, "Wow, that was quite a show," but I'm wondering, who was this? This Shloimi did not look like such a tzaddik that he should be rushed into heaven so much. And me, I really did dedicate my life to Torah and tefillah and to avoda. How come I'm sitting on the sofa? So he goes up to one of the angels and he says, "Was tutzach? How come he got ahead of me?" And they said to him, "Rabbi, you don't understand. When you get up and you give a sermon, everyone falls asleep. But when Shloimi drives his Egged bus, everyone starts davening." Okay. All right, that's it for the joke. It will be cut out of the online version. So tonight's topic, Menachem Begin, 1913 to 1992. This is actually the centennial of his birth. I believe his birthday is right around this time of year as well. I'm sorry I didn't look up the specific date, but we are at the centennial of his birth. How appropriate we should speak about him tonight. He is, of course, most famous for being the 6th Prime Minister of Israel, the first who did not come from the left-wing Mapai or Labor Party, as we shall see, a very important change in Israel. He is associated with a group called the Irgun, a very important pre-state British resistance movement, or resistance to the British movement, controversial as we shall discuss. But despite his very right-wing credentials, he definitely was a hawk, very warlike, with a sense of unease with regards peace treaties and accommodation with the Arabs, he was ironically the first Israeli prime minister to sign a peace treaty with any of the neighboring Arab states. So he was quite literally the hawk who made peace, and that peace, although it is not without some tension, nevertheless has maintained stability since 1978 when it first began. So he's an unusual figure, a figure with contradictions, a figure with internal turmoil, great tragedy in his own personal life and great victory at the same time, a man of incredible tenacity and a man of great achievement, as we shall discuss. So he was born in Brest-Litovsk, which was then in Poland. His father came from a long line of rabbis, although he himself was not practicing as a rabbi. He was working in the lumber business. The family was also very Zionistic. In many ways, actually, it's kind of like my grandmother, Allah Shalom, her sort of orientation with pro-Hebraic, pro-Zionist, Eastern European orientation. As a youth, he first enrolled in a group called the Hashomer HaTzair youth group. The Hashomer HaTzair is a very left-wing, really communist Zionist group, but he left after 2 years, and at the age of 14 he joined a much more right-wing group called Beitar. Hashomer HaTzair means the young guard, and that is a really sort of communist sounding phrase, you know, like Komsomol, the communist youth, things like that. Beitar, on the other hand, is a reference to a place name in Israel, the Great Battle of Beitar, associated with the rebellion against the Romans in ancient times, which was a site of great victory for the Romans and tragedy for the Jews, but nevertheless it's a symbol of Jewish resistance to occupation. And that's really the motivating principle of Beitar, was to train youth in Israel, in Poland, for an eventual paramilitary role in Israel in the forthcoming Zionist state. He went to law school at the University of Warsaw. He gained his law degree, but he never practiced law, although his expertise in language was well noted even as a young man. He was fluent in classic languages, in many European languages. He wrote and spoke in English, and of course in classical Hebrew as well, and he was famous for being a great orator. His critics called him a demagogue, but nevertheless he was definitely a master of the spoken word, something that he attributed to his training in Warsaw. But his principal influence, without a doubt, was a man that he frequently called Mori Urebi, my master and teacher, Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky is a fascinating, very important character. Perhaps in later classes we'll look at his life in detail. But basically, he swam in the opposite direction of much of the secular Jewish movements of the day. Communism, socialism, the idea of druzhba narodov, we explored in previous classes, the idea that, you know, the Jews should participate in a proletarian world in which there is no more criticism between nationalities, there's no more racism, no more hatred. That's where most Jews were kind of voting. And if they were Zionists as well, they are voting with their feet to create that kind of reality in the state of Israel, what would be the state of Israel. We discussed it last week with Golda Meir. Was typical for much of the youth of Poland at the time. Jabotinsky, on the other hand, had a radically different approach. Jabotinsky felt that fundamentally the Jews had to go it alone. This idea of, you know, all the nations setting aside their differences once they recognized that their true enemies were not national enemies, they were class enemies. He felt that that was all garbage. It was all, you know, just hogwash that people were lovingly drinking up, but it was meaningless. He felt that ultimately the Jews had to stand on their own 2 feet, and they had to take responsibility for their own survival and not trust to the general goodwill of society as a whole. This is also in great contrast to Herzl, who, although Herzl was not a socialist by any means, his vision of Israel was something like, you know, Vienna on the Mediterranean. If you ever seen Haifa, for example, that's really kind of Herzl's city. You know, people get along, they're polite, they say hello to each other in the streets, and, you know, there's not too much fighting going on. That's really what what Herzl had in mind. So Herzl was spending most of his time going from world power to world power with the early shuttle diplomacy, trying to convince, the head of England, the head of Germany, and so on, to support the Zionist venture. Jabotinsky said that's all a waste of time. We can't trust anybody. We must do it on our own. The critics of Jabotinsky said he was an early integral nationalist. That's kind of like the nice technical term for fascist, meaning that they were very into typical things that were associated with the fascists. A chauvinistic attitude, the idea that the Jews are better than everybody else. A militaristic bent, very much into parades and insignia and paramilitary drills. Less of a democratic structure, more of a charismatic leadership structure. These kinds of ideas were definitely associated with Jabotinsky. At the same time, I think it's unfair to put him in this kind of camp because he had a very broad-minded approach to the national struggle of many other peoples. And in contradistinction to many of his peers, for example, he felt very positively about the Ukrainian national movement, which was excoriated by many Jews at that time. So he was a really complicated character. Begin encountered him at an early age and became his right-hand man. By the age of 22, he was already appearing beside him at the World Congress of Revisionists, which was the name of Jabotinsky's party, as we shall see. And Jabotinsky's perhaps greatest claim to fame was his backing of Jewish self-defense. Recall that during this period, there are ongoing waves of pogroms against Jews in Eastern Europe, most notably the beginning of the 1880s, and then with increasing rapidity and ferocity in the first decade of the 20th century, the second decade of the 20th century, just incredible numbers of attacks on Jews in small villages. So Jabotinsky argued that Jews should organize their own self-defense societies, where typically young Jews would get together, train themselves, and be prepared for the attacks of hooligans that would typically come on the railroads at the time. He was beloved by the youth. He was mistrusted by the older generation, who felt that these self-defense units would just exacerbate the problem and it would look like a provocation, whereas the older Jews were saying, you know what, we should just keep things calm, we should follow what the Torah says, pray for the welfare of the government so that they leave us alone. Jabotinsky represented a radical new type of thinking that was ultimately very influential. Now, what I'm going to show you here today, I'm very proud of. My daughter, Danit Malka, helped me put this slide together. Most of my slides are very simple with no animation or things like this. This is going to be animation super. Because, and I just have to give you a little history lesson, most of you in this room remember the old teaching technology called chalkboards. Remember? So my wife actually, many years ago, she bought me a little metal sleeve to hold the chalk in, because otherwise I would come home, my right side was just covered in chalk from teaching. And I used to teach this particular class on a blackboard, not even a green board. And then, I started going to transparencies. Remember those plastic clear sheets you would write on them? So then I used that. And then when I went to PowerPoint, I couldn't do it. And now finally, with my Mac, I figured out how to do it with my daughter's help. And so I'm going to go back to old style teaching, but it's very complicated. Get ready. Okay, so it's an important moment for me. So here, this is the thing. The political spectrum. So for the rest of the world, the political spectrum only has two ends to it, right? Left and right. That's very simple. It's, towards the socialist end and towards the capitalist end. And that's push it. That's obvious. Jews can't leave it alone. It has to be more complicated. We have two axes for our political spectrum, a left to right and an up and down. So here we go. Let me label these. There are four cardinal points. The first is Zionism. The second is something called Doekite, which I'll explain to you what that means in a second. The third is capitalism. The fourth is socialism. So what are these four elements in the Jewish political spectrum? So let's put Zionism up here. And by Zionism, obviously, we understand the movement to create a Jewish homeland in the land of Palestine. We've spoken about it in a few different lectures, but that's going to be at the top, the y-axis of the spectrum. Doekite, the word do in Yiddish means here. So Doekite means here-ness, And it's the opposite of Zionism in that some Jews, let's say in Poland, would say we should be striving to create a Jewish polity over there, Dortigkeit if you want, there in Israel. But other Jews would say, no, let's reorganize ourselves here in Poland, a diaspora nationalism. So Jews would separate along this y-axis, some more towards Dortigkeit, more towards Zionism. Then, of course, on the right wing, we have capitalism. You don't have, I think it's unfair to really call Jews fascists for reasons that are obvious, but there are some that definitely go further to the right, as we shall see. But capitalism is essentially, in favor of the free market economy. John Smith, the idea that, as long as you give people as much freedom so that they do not impinge on others' freedoms, then the society will prosper as a whole, and so on. And that's contrasted with socialism, which is the idea that, no, you have to have a command economy controlled from the top that regulates how, income is generated and spent and shared and so on. Those are our 4 cardinal points. Any questions so far about these? It's as clear as the sun at noonday. But wait, it will get more confusing. So let's look at some of the main political parties of the day. And by the way, right now I'm talking about the period between, let's say, 1905, when the Tsarist Empire first allowed political parties to actively work, until 1912, which is the foundation of one of the last parties we'll talk about. So this is what the complexion of Jews politically were at the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The so-called Allgemeine Zionisten, or general Zionists, so-called because they had to be distinguished from about 7 other kinds of Zionists. This is basically Herzl's party. They were the largest single Zionist party, and they were obviously on the top end of this scale towards Zionism, but they also believed in capitalism. They felt that, the new Jewish land in Palestine should be basically a Western economy. These are contrasted with the Bundists, and this was basically a communist-style party. They were social democrats who were both socialist and very much not in favor of Zionism. They felt that Zionism was moving backwards against the tide of history, which tried to minimize national differences. The Bundists said we should try to the Zionists, the trend of history is to minimize national differences. They wanted to be down here with Dortigkeit. Then the third group would be the Poale Zion. We spoke about them last week with Golda Meir. This is her party. The Workers of Zion, who believe in Zionism, and at the same time, they are socialists. They want Israel to exist, to be the Jewish homeland, but they want it to be a socialist country. And then finally, the last group, which is the Volkspartei, very small group. This is Shimon Dubnov's party that we spoke about many weeks ago, that believed, no, we should work on Jewish politics here in the diaspora, and it should be fundamentally capitalist. Okay. Any questions so far? Yes, go ahead.
Volkspartei, is that the correct spelling?
That's a Yiddish transliteration. Yeah,
maybe I was getting a little crazy.
You could call it, it's Volkspartei in Yiddish, because it's a Yiddishist party. Okay, we're all right with this? Now, here's an important party for us. These are the Revisionists. The Revisionists, this is Jabotinsky's party. This is the intellectual origins of Menachem Begin's policies. The Revisionists, so-called because they wanted to revise things, they took their cue from the revisionist parties after World War I as well, that parties that were unhappy with the status quo and wanted to change everything. They are ultra-Zionist and ultra-capitalist in the sense that they want no truck with other peoples. They really believed in the toxicity of non-Jews, and they were untrustworthy, and they had to be handled kind of like, at a full arm's length, and essentially the Jews had to stand on their own 2 feet and just take it. They believed in much more aggressive, even violent means to achieve this end, very militaristic, and very kind of pessimistic about the possibility of a flourishing of peace in the region. Now we'll see how that plays out in Menachem Begin's life in a moment. So far, have you really enjoyed the animation? Did you like the?
Fine.
Yeah. So now here, I normally don't like this, but since I learned how to do it, I started having fun. Let me tell you what happened to these parties, just to jump ahead in our lecture a little bit. What happened to these parties since then. So I'm going to take you up to the present day. What happens to these parties? So first of all, what happened to the Bund? Boom. Isn't that cool? Did you like that? It came dropping down and made like the dust. Okay. They became, in the Soviet Union, they became communists, and then Stalin killed them all. So that was it for them. In the United States, they became a group called the Workmen's Circle, which some of you may have some familiar with. It was very popular in the first half of the 20th century, a kind of a quasi-socialist Jewish group, very active in New York City in particular. Now here goes. All right. Now here's another animation. That's nice. Kind of the star that goes by like that. The Volkspartei had a major influence on the structure of the Jewish Federation movement. Obviously, the Federation is not a party, but the philosophy of Volkspartei influenced the Federation, and they essentially observe its teachings. Here's a third one, the Pole Zion. Wow, that's the flashing bulbs. They became the Labor Party, and the General Zionists and the Revisionists joined, and they formed this party. The Flames, right? Likud. So that's where we are today. Sort of the major orientations of like, as they say in Yiddish, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. Right? Nothing changes. It's always the same. It's not actually Yiddish, but I think at least one of you knows that. Okay, so that's basically where we're looking at now. Begin, Jabotinsky are way over here in the revisionist corner, and they've got all these other parties that disagree with them. Okay. So back to his life. He was very, very active in Beitar, the youth wing of Jabotinsky's revisionist movement, and he actually would travel around Europe, garnering support and encouraging young people to join this movement. And while he was traveling around, he would stay, of course, in the homes of various wealthy supporters. It was at one of these homes that he met a young woman named Eliza Arnold, and 1 month later they were married. And they had an incredible relationship that lasted until her death. I guess it would be about, I can't do the math off the top of my head, but they had a very, very strong relationship that lasted till the end of her life. And in fact, when she eventually passed away, he was devastated, and it really represented the end of his career and ultimately his life as well. She was a retiring figure who really stood in the background whenever possible. In fact, when she was honored, when Begin was invited to speak with Jimmy Carter after he became prime minister, she was honored at a dinner of that nature, and the audience was shocked that she refused to speak. She just got up and said thank you, and they said, aren't you going to make a speech about politics or Israel? And she said, my husband is the speaker, and she sat down. So she really was a kind of stay in the background kind of person, but she endured tremendous suffering on behalf of her husband that was really quite remarkable. Here she is, of course, shown with their oldest son, Benny. They had 3 children. Benny later went into politics, Begin. In this particular picture, it's taken from when he was in hiding in Israel. He was on the hunt. He was hunted by the British, and so he pretended to be an Orthodox rabbi named Sassover, I think, living in a regular neighborhood where even Irgun members, and he was the leader of Irgun, had no idea who he was. And they were like inviting him into their secret circles and things like that when he was really... No, yeah, that's true. We'll get to that. But still in Poland. So he's in Poland in the late 1930s. And he happens to be working primarily on organizing illegal immigration to Palestine. He's organizing Jews, organizing boats, trying to get them into the land of Israel when war breaks out. He happened to be in Lithuania at the outbreak of the war, and Lithuania had kind of a tragic moment of peace at the beginning of the war because Stalin and Hitler had not completely worked out who was going to take over a portion of that territory. It happened that once that was settled, Begin found himself on the Soviet side, and since he was a prominent Zionist activist, he was arrested by the Soviets before he could be arrested by the Nazis, who would of course invade Lithuania a couple years later. He was sent out to the gulag, where he was tortured and imprisoned for several years for his activity with the party. This is his Soviet mugshot from the time. But then what happened, as we discussed in previous classes, is that in June 22nd of 1941, the Nazis double-crossed Stalin, and they invaded the Soviet Union, and all of a sudden the Soviet Union looked to their prisoners in the various gulags to see if they could dig up some allies to fight the Nazis. So Begin was released to join the Polish army, which was then fighting on the Eastern Front with the Nazis. And ultimately, from the Polish army, he was transferred to Israel in May of 1942. Wow. Well, because the division of the Polish army, the Jewish Polish soldiers, they set up a special unit in Palestine to fight alongside the British. Because remember, the British and the Polish are allies at this point, and that's his kind of circuitous route. Ironically, he wanted to stay in Eastern Europe and continue fighting against the Nazis, but he was urged by his followers to go take the fight to Israel. Which wasn't the same kind of fight at all, because there was no hostilities, active hostilities, no front line in Israel itself. But of course, that was the homeland, and ultimately he was had much more of an impact there in Israel. At this time, if we move to Israel and understand what's going on, we skipped over this a little bit last week because it's more relevant to us in our lecture today. The Arab-Israeli relationship is going south very rapidly. There's a lot of debate over the demographics about how many people actually lived in Palestine at the beginning of the 20th century, but there's no question that the Jewish population and the Arab population grew proportionately, which leads many Israeli interpreters to say that as more Jews moved to Israel and created more of an economic infrastructure, bringing a lot of Western support with them, a lot of Western know-how, draining the swamps, that kind of image, a lot of Arabs were also attracted from Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan for the economic opportunities that this new population represented. And that was going fine until the 1920s, because the Poale Zion, which you recall, they are like the more socialist, more dovish orientation, which dominated Israeli politics for so long, they discovered that some of their socialist ideologies were counterproductive in the land of Israel. Specifically, they had two values that came into conflict with one another. On the one hand, they wanted to have, obviously, peaceful, harmonious relations with the indigenous Arab population or the new Arab populations. That was to be sure. But on the other hand, they valued, as socialists, the notion that Jews should get their fingers in the dirt. They should work with their backs with the land. They really wanted to get away from the kind of, Eastern European mentality of Jews as accountants or Jews as indoor people, pasty, scholarly, weaklings. They wanted to have strong new Jews who are farmers, who work the land. So the Arabs loved the economic opportunities of the manual labor, picking the oranges and tending to the crops and things like that. But that meant that a lot of the Jews ended up being like kind of small businessmen, managing these farms or managing commercial relations with the Arabs, and they were not creating the new Jew that they so hoped to do. So the Poale Zion instituted a policy of Jewish labor that was intended to get regular Jews off their butts in their offices and into the fields working. Excuse my language. Can we cut that out, Elia, please, when you do the Torah Cafe version? Get them into the fields, muscular and tanned, and that's the kind of idea. But that meant that the Arabs didn't have work, because they had to let go of the Arabs in order to hire the Jews to work in the fields. And this sparked a significant amount of economic protest, because a lot of Arabs said, what is this? We came here, you need work, you're not hiring us, that's discrimination. And so you had an increasing level of economic tension that eventually morphed into a violent conflict. There's several major riots of this nature. They were tied to other elements as well. I'm making it very simplistic by looking just at the economic aspect of it. But the rioting, it kind of mirrored the pogrom activity in Eastern Europe, and it was escalating rather than getting better. So this is the environment into which Jabotinsky found himself with the Arabs. Added to that was the fact that the British had just published a very anti-Zionist position paper called the White Paper that was an attempt to deal with the violence that was increasing between Arabs and Jews. The White Paper was compared by this thing called the Peel Commission that argued for essentially a separation of Jews and Arabs with some internalization of certain zones like Jerusalem and so on. But on the whole, it benefited the Arab position. And many Jews felt that they had been betrayed by the British, who had in 1917 made that fantastic Balfour Declaration to include in their goals the idea of a homeland for Jews in Palestine. The worst part of it, of course, was the World War, and especially the constriction on immigration. You recall that, we're moving quickly through the period, but Britain is in control of Israel at this time. Britain is obviously fighting against the Nazis. The Arabs decide to join with the Axis powers. So the Arab nations surrounding Israel become pro-German. And England here has a little foothold in the Middle East. They are obviously pro-allies. So the Palestinian Jews, like Begin at this time, decide that they're going to throw in their lot with the British against the Arabs, because even though they don't want the British there and they feel that the British are persecuting them and not allowing enough Jews to live there and so on, at the same time, the enemy that they share, the Nazis, was far more grievous than their temporary difficulties. And so therefore, the various Jewish underground movements said at this point, you know what, we're complaining about the British, we don't like the restrictions they placed on us, but we are going to suspend that, and we are going to cooperate with the British in our attempt to rid the world of Nazism. Shortly after the war, which of course ends positively in terms of the major conflict, the Brits immediately return to that very restrictive immigration policy, which is disastrous because after the Holocaust, you have an incredible number of displaced Jews. Somewhere, I'm just guessing now, but there has to be at least 3 or 4 million displaced Jews who cannot go to their homes either because of the political situation. A lot of these homes have been overrun by the communists now, or because of the hostility that's still regnant there, or even more basically, the notion that they're not wanted back home. The notorious pogrom in Kielce in 1946, in which Jews were accused after the Holocaust of drinking the blood of Christian children, was, it was just a clarion call for Jews to get out of the graveyard of Europe and go to Israel. So you have all these Jews who are amassing in displaced persons camps, and they want to go to Israel. World opinion looks upon this with favor after the news of the tremendous devastation of the Holocaust gets out, and Britain is increasingly beleaguered trying to keep these Jews out of Israel because that antagonizes the Arabs when they're really losing this major opinion poll in the world in terms of public opinion. So Begin again is involved in smuggling Jews into Palestine, and as we discussed at length last week, so I won't go into detail here, the United Nations decides to partition Israel. The Jews accept the partition plan, the Arabs reject it, and you have a massive war that lasts over a year, which ultimately Israel emerges from successfully. Yes, Ms. Weiser.
There was in Haifa a Nazi colony, or a lot of German people living in Haifa at that time, at the same time, and there were riots against, they make riots against the Jews coming into Palestine also.
Oh, that's fascinating. I've never heard of a Nazi colony in Israel. There are definitely Germans there, but I did not know it was that. Wow.
Very, very
but on the television here.
Wow. Now, my grandmother, she always used to say that the jails are full in Israel too. That was a bit of wisdom.
It's inclusive, even in a tour of Haifa, they take you to where the Germans used to live, but they were really acting as being part of the Nazi party.
Incredible, incredible.
So I wonder what was the reaction from the British people
Your question exceeds my ability to answer. It's fascinating. I'll have to look it up. Okay, shall we go on a little bit? I've got more stuff on Begin we got to go to. Okay, so what was Begin doing at this time? Again, the Irgun was the collective name for his new movement in Israel. He rapidly became the leader of the Irgun, which was most distinguished from something called the Haganah. Haganah literally means defense, and the Haganah was basically the military wing of the Mapai Labor Party. The socialist, Coalition party had its own forces, and they implemented policies that were consistent with the ideals of socialism. The Irgun, which means essentially the organization, was based on revisionist principles, and not surprisingly, these two military forces often came to severe disagreement and even blows. Very significant conflict on a number of occasions. The most significant question was, how do we deal with the British? The Haganah wanted to adopt a much more diplomatic approach while clearly opposing the British and wanting them to lift their restrictions on immigration and so on. They felt that the British were ultimately civilized people and they could sit down and talk with them, and that there was a way to perhaps work things out. The Irgun, again, consistent with the revisionist principles, felt that that was just, a pipe dream and not worth thinking about at all. The only way to get the British out of Israel was to drive them out. And they implemented policies that were much more aggressive towards the British. Most importantly, the notorious bombing of the King David Hotel in July of 1946. This was the headquarters of the British in Israel, and the warnings were issued. The Irgun placed several bombs in the basement of this hotel, which of course still stands in Israel today. It was rebuilt. And they issued several warnings in several different media, including phone calls to the switchboard itself. And the British ignored those warnings. There was a major investigation afterwards, and the British, although definitely holding the Irgun to blame for this attack, they also took some responsibility themselves for not heeding those warnings. Part of the reason perhaps for not heeding the warnings was because bomb threats were very common and they were typically ignored, like fire drills in condominiums here in Surfside, that kind of thing. But the bombs did in fact go off in the middle of the day when the building was at its peak capacity. 91 people were killed and 46 were hurt, and that includes British citizens, Jews and Arabs as well. And this represented a major turning point in the escalation of violence between the Israeli underground and the British. And a bounty was placed on Begin's head. I'll show you the picture of it in a minute, where he was. They would offer £10,000 for anyone who could bring him back dead or alive, because he was the leader and mastermind of this movement. There was also very, very harsh criticism from the Jewish Haganah, who wanted to call off this entire episode. And Ben Gurion, who was the leader of the Mapai party, he was later the first prime minister of Israel, he felt that Begin was a type of terrorist that was harming the Jewish cause with these kinds of intemperate actions. And in some cases, the Haganah even captured the Irgun fighters and gave them over to the British.
Nice.
So the Haganah is at the same time fighting the British, but the Jews have not got their act together either. The Haganah and the Irgun are fighting bitterly as well. Yes, Mr. Lax.
What was the purpose or the expected result from trying to warn the switchboard that was going to be attacked?
Well, I don't think that the Irgun's intent was to kill. Their intent was to send a message that, you're not safe anywhere. And by the way, we should realize that this is happening to the British at the same time in India. They're having a miserable time with Mahatma Gandhi, with Jinnah and the Muslim Brotherhood, Muslim Party, I forget what they call it over there, and the British essentially give up on India at the same time too. They're just taking a beating from their colonial powers because they're no longer wanted in those places. So the idea was to send a clear message: we don't want you here, and the message was certainly received. Yes.
Well, I think that it proved out that the Irgun was right as far as the British was concerned, because in most instances, most of the people that were British, that were in Palestine at the time, really didn't give much of a hoot for the Jews or their position.
I'm not
I
going
don't
to.
wanna take
Yeah, I don't want to
this
pass
way.
judgment. My goal here is to just try and present the facts in as neutral a position as way. And of course, you can interpret them any way you like. But I'm doing my best to maintain objectivity. I have students who are on the other end of that camera that have to hear this. Okay. Anyway, here's a kind of a cool bounty picture, and it's helpfully circled for us too. Okay, another major event which occurred in the context of the Arab-Israeli war, and very important for understanding Begin's policies and Israeli politics afterwards, is the massacre at an Arab village called Deir Yassin. It really deserves a far more detailed treatment than I can provide in the short time I've allotted. But basically what happened was Irgun and allied Lehi forces attacked an Arab village that was significant for strategic reasons. And although Begin himself was not involved in the operation, he was not present at the time, he argued for restraint. Something went wrong. There's a lot of debate over what went wrong exactly, but there was a horrible massacre of men, women, and children in this little village. Numbers differ. Some bring it as low as 100 people, others place it as high as 300, but it's universally recognized that this was a massacre of civilians by an early resistance movement that had become part of the Israeli Defense Forces, and the Israelis were roundly criticized for this atrocity. Again, if we had more time, we can go into the back and forth as to how it went wrong. The warnings were issued, the loudspeakers weren't working, they were fired upon first, there are all kinds of things circling around, but the bottom line is there were about 200 dead civilians at the hands of a force of this nature. What is especially important for our purposes, though, is that Deir Yassin was a major turning point for the beginning of the Palestinian refugee problem, because many Arabs in Israel said, my gosh, these people are savages, and they fled Israel. They fled the war zone. Now, many Arabs felt that they would soon be returning with victorious Arab armies and claiming property from the Jews who had been driven into the sea. But any way you look at it, there was this fear generated that the Arabs were not safe in the new Israel, and that they had to leave simply for the safety of their own families. And again, you can politicize the event, but it is a turning point in the Arab-Israeli relationship early on in the war. And at the same time, once again, while the Arabs and the Israelis are fighting, the Israelis and the Israelis are fighting. And perhaps the worst moment is the so-called Altalena affair, which is in June 1948. The Altalena was the name of a boat that was commissioned to bring immigrants making aliyah to Israel from Europe, from the displaced persons camp, along with a large container load or a large cargo of weapons, including tanks, machine guns, large weaponry. And the agreement was that since this was a boat that was to be that was entirely financed by Irgun supporters, and there were Irgun members on board, that these weapons would go to the new Irgun units of the Israeli Defense Forces. Remember that when the state was declared, you had all these kind of ragtag militia with various degrees of organization, with different political complexions. They were not a unified army with uniforms and chain of command and things like that. They had to kind of patch together these various groups into a unified fighting force. So the Irgun said, sure, we're going to cooperate with Ben Gurion's Haganah, but we have our own guns, thank you, and we have all our own people, and we're going to work it this way. So they hammered out an agreement about how to divide the arms, and they came to disagreement once this boat reached Israeli shores. It went up and down the coast a little while, with the Irgun demanding more of a share of the weapons, the Haganah demanding their share of the weapons, and ultimately, and again, it may be a whole series of missed radio communications, but the Haganah fired on the Irgun ship and actually set it ablaze, and it was eventually scuttled, as you can see here, within view of the Tel Aviv beach. So this is, more left-wing Ben Gurion Haganah forces firing on a ship full of Irgun Jews and weapons, losing all the weapons in the process, killing a handful, about 16 people were killed. Begin was on the ship, and there's a large supposition that perhaps they were hoping to assassinate Begin personally because he was such a thorn in their side. Ultimately, Begin did make it ashore. There was a gunfight between these various forces on shore as well, and they managed to get a ceasefire and patch it together, but it showed a great moment of betrayal of the Irgun cause by the more left-wing Haganah. Mr. Lax.
Did Yitzhak Rabin have a role in this?
I don't remember what Rabin's role in it, but I'm sure he was involved. It was Ben Gurion for sure. Yes, Ms. Abramson.
He was actually in the group of the Haganah.
Oh my gosh. Okay, there you go. Thank you, Ms. Abramson. You're destined to be a historian one day, unless you can find a better Parnassa. Okay.
Ben was involved in that.
No kidding. You were involved in this as well?
Yes, I was.
That's amazing. Do you want to share anything with us?
Not
Mr. Rodriguez,
particularly.
get. Now, I have students who would like to hear something. I give you the microphone. Just tell us something about your experience. Just a
Well,
minute.
we were called out. I was in a brigade with Yitzhak Rabin,
Uh-huh.
and we were called out to Kfar Vitkin. It was a settlement on the ocean, not far from Tel Aviv, not to let the people from the Altalena to come ashore.
Oh my gosh. That's phenomenal.
And they were right, because Begin had just a fight with the British. He didn't had no history of building up the country or anything.
Yeah. he
So
came in.
they didn't let them. They didn't let them to come ashore.
So did you actually see the events of the picture?
Yeah,
here?
I saw the whole thing.
Wow, that's amazing. Look at that. See, this is, where else are you going to get history lectures like this? I'm telling you. That's great. Okay. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on. We've got about 10 minutes left. Now, immediately after the War of Independence ends, Begin joins the loyal opposition, which, as I saw in one interesting online article, he was probably in the opposition longer than any other political figure in Western history. He was in the opposition from 1948 until he came to power in 1977. An amazingly strong record of tenacity. He was an incredibly strong critic of the left, and Ben Gurion in particular, and the Altalena affair was, his moment of clarity for all those things. And he stood in great contrast to these leftist figures, whereas, the socialist kind of ideal was very working class proletarian. They would walk in shirt sleeves and no tie and very casual, whereas Begin was always seen only in a suit and tie, always, speaking very carefully. He had this concept of hadar, which means like kind of glory or beauty that he took from Jabotinsky, the idea that you have to look like a mensch at all times. And his critique of the leftist government was very strong, including a major 1952 demonstration that turned into a riot in Israel because Begin felt that they should not accept any of the reparation money coming from Germany in Israel. He felt that it was a travesty to the memory of those who were killed in the Holocaust, and he had quite a few supporters that led to a major riot, even though they ended up continuing this. Now, it's interesting to note that the name of his party was Cherut, which means freedom, Cherut, and I heard from Simi Schreiber that he quoted someone, I can't remember, that Begin led us from avoda to Cherut, from slavery to freedom, right? Okay, well, anyways, yes, please.
Abdus
Abdus Lacherus, thank you.
He was a member of the Unity government in 1967. It's a very interesting account in the,
That's true.
in the Prime Minister by Yehuda Avner. I should have put my book. It's a very fascinating account.
It's an excellent book, amazing book.
Some news people questioning him and so on and so forth, but he was a member of the.
That's true.
Unity
He joined the National
Very
Unity government during
influential
6 Day War.
in convincing people to do certain things.
Right, absolutely. I should clarify that. By the loyal opposition, he did not lead the government, but he was a minister without portfolio in that government of 67. Now here, I know that what I'm going to present to you, to most of you in this room now, is going to be obvious and old material, but remember I have 19 through 24-year-olds who are watching this online, so I'm going to give them some information that may be shocking to them. And that is something about how the Israeli government works. It's very important to understand this in order to get a sense of it. So here's a picture of what our current American government looks like, which, according to some opinions, is, not entirely functional. But so here's the Senate. We have two bodies, of course. Here's the Senate. We have 45% of the membership is Republican, 53% is Democratic, with 2% who are independent. These are rough numbers. The actual numbers of seats are different. I rounded it out. Here in the House of Representatives, we have 53% Republican, 46% Democratic, and of course 0% who are independent or vacant right now. And this is, it's hard to get politics done when you have a pretty evenly divided situation like this. But look at what Israel looks like by contrast. Okay, so you've got, let's see, I've got 3, 6, 9, 12 parties dividing up 120 seats. And there are about 7 parties that didn't get enough votes to get a seat, but they're still in the elections. So how are you supposed to get any politics done when you have this kind of situation? So the very important thing you have to realize about Israeli politics, and again, I apologize to those of you for whom this is obvious, is everything in Israeli politics is about coalitions. Whenever they have an election, the president, which is largely a ceremonial figure, it's not a president like here where they're elected and so on. The president there is more of a figurehead for the state. The president invites the leader of the bloc that has the largest chunk. In this case, right now, that would be Likud, joined with Yisrael Beitenu, who has 26% of the seats, and says, okay, you have 26% of the seats, you have to get 51%, so go out, you have 2 weeks to make deals with the smaller parties to get them to join your coalition so you can have 51%. So they've never had, except for the time when they have national unity governments, when the two largest blocs come together, and that's only in the case of war, really, to deal with an external threat, they've never had one party that controls 51% of the seats in the Senate. There's always these very complicated arrangements between various parties trying to agree on a common cause. And it makes Israeli politics in many ways very fragile and easily toppled over. So in this case, we have in Israeli history, the labor movement had controlled the government, largely because of their coalitions with other parties from its inception in 1948 until the 1977 rebellion, or revolution, when suddenly Begin won the election. Now, he had been slowly gaining in popularity, but and here I mentioned, here's the national unity government. I have 1969, it should be 1967, I'm sorry. It was a difficult time for him to be in the government. He had a lot of disagreements with his co-members in the cabinet. But there were two populations in Israel, two large demographics that had felt largely disenfranchised by Israeli politics. Those were specifically the Sephardim, large numbers of Jews from Arab lands who had come to Israel after its establishment. In many cases they were refugees because the Arabs displaced them, expelled them once Israel was established. And they felt alienated from the very Ashkenazi, Eastern European approach of the traditional leadership of Israel. And secondly, religious voters, because the Israeli polity was led primarily by socialists who were anti-clerical, who were anti-religious, unfriendly to religion. And so you have all these Orthodox Jews, or even in the case of many Sephardim, let's say, Orthodox friendly, even though not especially observant, but they affiliated themselves as Orthodox, and they find themselves shut out of a government that's largely socialist and Ashkenazi. So these two large demographic bubbles began to grow, and their resentment was eventually sparked by Begin's standing for election. And he, although he himself was not strictly observant by contemporary standards, he was definitely very religious friendly, and he definitely knew how to speak to the Sephardim. And so these two groups really propelled him into the position of authority in 1977. Now, if you recall this wonderful slide, I want to make it more complicated because we can't forget about these guys. Remember that we have these four axes. Okay, I'm going to have to go through the whole thing. Now this part, I wish my clicker ran out of batteries. Torah Cafe, will you send me a regular supply of batteries so that I can keep this going? Okay, I'm joking. I'll get some batteries. So here's our four groups, and here's our parties. Come on. Right, we saw them before. Here's my favorite one. Oh no, not this one. Here's my favorite one. You ready? Wow, that's great. We should have some sound that go with it. Can I put sound on this? Okay, great. Okay, now, these are all our parties. We saw them before, but Jews can't leave this alone. There's not only two axes, there's a third axis, like a cube, a z-axis. It looks like this. So as it were, you've already got a political spectrum that's doubled because of that, but now it has depth as well. And who's on this axis? The religious parties. We didn't talk about those guys at all. But now there are also religious parties that are active since 1912. One of them that's very important is the National Religious Party, which feels that the expansion of Israel is a religious imperative. Much more in line with Jabotinsky's ideal that, the land of Israel has to expand to incorporate all the immigrants that will come in the time of Messiah. And so they see this aggressive attitude towards the Arabs as a religious idea. Now that's obviously not the only position held by religious Jews. Another one that dates from before the war, called the Agudat Yisrael, also very popular and strong here in America today. They were religious, but they did not believe in Zionism as a political desideratum. They felt that Zionism had to wait for the Messiah. But have you heard that the Agudat Yisrael, they have a presence in Israel as well? That's because after the Holocaust, whoops. Oh no, I'm not going to do through the whole thing. Oh my gosh, that would be terrible. But basically what happened, this is my favorite part too. I pushed the wrong button. Okay, come on, fast forward. We'll go through these. Come on. I know, this is tedious. I'm not going to do this again. Bang, that's my favorite one. Okay, there we go. Here we go. Israeli politics, oh my gosh. Republicans and Democrats, this lecture would be over if we were only doing them. Okay, here we go. And here's the here's the Agudat Yisrael. And after the Holocaust, because there was really no Jews left in Eastern Europe, they moved to the Zionist position. And so you've got these two parties over here who are significant. They can be major power brokers in contemporary Israel. And we can add other parties as well, like Shas and so on. They join with the Likud, and they give Begin that bump that puts him over the edge and gives him the election. I'm going to have to skip on a little bit because I'm running out of time. The most dramatic moment in Begin's premiership, without a doubt, is his remarkable peace with Egypt. Now, as Yehuda Avner points out very effectively in his book, Begin did do a lot of the groundwork to allow it to happen. He knew Sadat's travel itinerary. Anwar Sadat, of course, the president of Egypt. And Begin traveled to those same locations, like to see the Shah of Tehran, for example, Shah of Iran. And he met with him before Sadat would show up. And he would tell him, listen, if Sadat ever makes any overtures, we'd love to talk with him. And then, of course, he would go back to Israel, and Sadat would visit the Shah of Iran. The Shah would say, I just met with Menachem Begin, and he said really nice things about you. Kind of like Aharon, making peace, ironically. So when Sadat made a rather dramatic speech in Egypt about the possibility of bilateral talks with Israel, which was something that was in both Israel and Egypt's interest because Jimmy Carter was trying to push multilateral talks in Geneva that had some disadvantages for them, then Sadat said he would be open to the idea of talking with anyone, even Israel, about peace. So right away, Begin initiated a conversation, and dramatically, Sadat took a plane to Israel to meet with him. A phenomenal sea change in Middle Eastern politics. I happen to remember it. I was only 2 years old at the time, but I do remember seeing it on TV. Not quite 2, but this is a picture of them greeting at the airport. Begin, again, consistent with his pro-religious attitude, insisted that his plane only arrive well after Shabbat on Saturday night, so that people could, observe the Shabbat and then hear about this and so on. And of course, as we know, they were able to hammer out a peace treaty. I don't have time to go into the details of it, but one of the more difficult things was that essentially Begin gave the entire Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. They had conquered it in 1967. They surrendered it in 1979 Accords. That was basically accepted by the Israeli population, but some very, very difficult moments as they dismantled the settlement of Yamit, in particular in 1982. Here you can see Israeli soldiers actually dragging children out of their homes in Yamit to give the land back to the Egyptians. But ultimately, as I mentioned earlier, even though Begin had a very hawkish personality, he nevertheless saw the opportunity for peace with Egypt, and it's ironic that he, of all the prime ministers, should be the one to actually seal that deal. I'm going to have to skip over the last couple things to stay on schedule, but his wife died in 1982, and Begin was never the same after that. She died when he was out of town. He was in Washington, and he retreated from public life, and he found that he did not have the heart to engage in political struggle anymore, so he eventually resigned shortly thereafterwards, and essentially led a life of very deep seclusion. He had a heart attack in 1984 and ultimately passed away. I forgot to mention, by the way, that he was also a Nobel laureate for his signing of the peace treaty with Sadat. And Sadat, who also won the Nobel Prize, was later assassinated by his own bodyguard, who had become close with the Muslim Brotherhood. But when we look at the overall legacy of Menachem Begin, we see an individual of tremendous intellectual resolve, willing to undergo incredible privation for his vision of the Jewish people, enduring torture and imprisonment under the Soviets, subject to a massive manhunt by the British, excoriated by the political establishment in his own country, and yet at the same time it was only under his watch that we were able to establish this basically lasting peace accord with Egypt. Fascinating character of many contradictions. And with this, I want to thank you very much for your attention, and look forward to speaking with you next week.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.